Today, first of all, I'd like to. Sure. Okay, he likes the camera too much. This is Nico. He's the one purring. Um, but today, I'd like to start on what is arguably not a sub. It's arguably not subgenres. Uh, it's arguably not a subgenre at all because it's two. Um, but it's arguably not subgenres either entirely of fantasy. It's more variations or a kind of thing that you have to decide which way you want to go. Um, Not necessarily on all aspects, but we'll get to that. I'm being pinned down by Nico right now. Yes, hello. I love you too. Uh, the issue is high versus low fantasy, and these are labels that I feel are very poorly described in most material that I've seen on the matter, because the common consensus seems to be that low fantasy is very much our world, but with fantasy elements in it, while high fantasy is something with its own maps and a lot more magic in it. Um, Low fantasy is kind of seen like more down to earth. Um, what did you do? He is a very playful little character, and that causes quite a mess. Um, the way I would describe high and low fantasy is a lot simpler. Low fantasy is more based in realism. It's closer to realism, I'd say. It's still fantasy, but it's closer to realism. Things that are truly fantastic, truly fantasy elements are toned down a whole lot more. Magic is not as common and not as strong. Fantasy. Hello again, boy. My boy. Fantasy creatures are not as plentiful and not as bizarre and not as extreme, be it in their power, in their behavior, or in their being in general. You don't jump back and forth between the fairy kingdom and our world all the time. Elves are basically just woodland people with some unusual characteristics, and so on and so forth. And the big deal tends to be the magic, though, um, because low fantasy magic is not as big of a game changer as magic might otherwise be. It is a curiosity, it has some powerful elements, it has some abilities that you do not find elsewhere, but it is less powerful and it is difficult to use, difficult to manage, often having some great costs attached to it, and very likely few people, if any common people at all, ever really truly see magic in their lives. It is medieval, but with some mystical elements to it. And most of all, how I deviate from the common descriptions I see of high and low magic elsewhere is that low magic does not have to take place in our world. It does not have to take place on a map that looks like ours or has the same historical roots or anything. And it definitely does not have to be more like our world. If you want something that is our world but with fantasy elements, go for urban fantasy. You can make urban fantasy more historical if you want, but this is not urban fantasy. This is just fantasy with all the extreme and exotic, esoteric, whatever things toned wildly down. And as a byproduct of that, stories will usually not be as extreme or bizarre as some would expect from fantasy. These stories may even be stories that could take place in at least historical fiction, medieval historical fiction, but possibly any major kind of fiction, but they have fantasy twists on them. This could be a murder mystery, it could be an action drama, it could be whatever, but it has some magical elements and perhaps some weird creatures to it. This is not Lord of the Rings. This is far more gritty um, than that, bordering actually on being a supernatural medieval setting. But as I've talked about before, supernatural very much divides the supernatural and the natural, and the supernatural is often seen as a possibly hostile, but definitely not welcome elements and often not recognized elements of our world. Whereas here, there is a level of recognition and integration of the fantasy elements, even if people don't see it in their daily lives. Most people have village lives and may at most see someone who was healed because of an accident, was healed by magic, or even just in part by magic. So it's a more grounded, down to earth kind of fantasy. Whereas high fantasy is great magic, bizarre magical creatures galore, um, elves everywhere, dwarves everywhere, goblins running in from the hills or whatever, um, constant fairy plots to, I don't know, steal babies or whatever they do in that world in particular. And of course, great magic and white knights slaying dragons and saving the world on a daily basis, more or less. This is the fantasy of great shining spires and mighty castles. This is not grounded, this is not down to earth. This is fantasy run a bit rampant. And the thing is that, yeah, I never got into to hard sci-fi. I didn't get into that yet. I should have, but I didn't. I missed a few points. But low fantasy is kind of the hard sci-fi of fantasy. That a lot of it is made to be realistic, or as realistic as fantasy can be, I should say. High fantasy does not care about that. It breaks all the rules of nature with reckless disabandon. With reckless abandon? Reckless abandon. Um, and the thing is that you can have these two extremes of the spectrum. Um, both are essentially classic fantasy. Just it's about uh, how high you crank the dial up. If you keep the dial at zero, you got historical medieval stuff. If you got it at one, you got very low fantasy, where some magical things are known to exist, and the forests may harbor strange creatures that you mostly meet if you get lost or if you try to take up arms against the forest, if you try to destroy the forest or whatever. Um, but if you crank it up to 10, you've got full on high fantasy with dragons crisscrossing the sky, fighting griffins, and all those elvish plots and dwarven made goods being sold in the city, goblins pickpocketing, whatever. But between those extremes, between 1 and 10, you have a very wide range of fantasy that you can choose from. You can have something around middle where, yeah, sure, magic is around. Most people have seen magic, but it's not the kind that burns whole cities to the ground or builds castles from nothing. That's not the kind. And yeah, there are dragons, but most people do not run into them. Even if they know where they are, they may actually try to avoid them for very good reasons. And elves and dwarves are like seeing a foreigner in a small town. It happens, and people don't faint from it usually, but it's not like an everyday sight. And you can crank it as high as you want, you can crank it as low as you want. The whole map thing, I think, is just kind of stupid. If you want low fantasy on a map that you made that has nothing to do with our world, go ahead. It's still low fantasy. Um, High fantasy, it's almost expected, but you can have high fantasy in our world, in our historical world. The stories of King Arthur is basically high fantasy, set in medieval England or parts of it even pre-medieval, whatever that is called, and that definitely has some high fantasy elements to it. If it isn't high fantasy full out, depending on the stories. But moreover, everything doesn't have to fall on the same spot on that scale. You can have magic be, let's say, a 7, but fantasy creatures be only a 4. Yeah, sure, there are elves and dwarfs and whatever, but you don't run into them uh, usually. If you do, you notice it. Maybe there's a half elf sitting in a tavern, or a dwarf comes into market with some special things to sell, but you don't usually run into them. Some races you run into more often than others, but in general, it's a very if you're if you're dealing with human characters, those characters will usually be in very human populated areas. Um, but the magic can still be high, so you have rare sightings of exotic races, but healing and enchanted weaponry and stuff like that is all around. Even if it's not full on a 10, it's there, and it means it plays a role in society. So you don't have to go full on anything with high or low fantasy. You can adjust whatever you want as you want it. And that usually gets ignored a bit, which bothers me because it stereotypes fantasy a lot, and even classic fantasy shouldn't be stereotyped. You can use stereotypical fantasy if you want, but it's a choice. You can adjust it in any of many ways. You can even have the mundane things be high fantasy, and the supernatural things all be low fantasy, like something, a world full of amazing, illogically huge castles and fortresses and ebony archways and whatever, but very little sorcery or demons or dragons to be seen. Anything from either high or low fantasy can be, theoretically at least, combined, and it usually makes for a more interesting experience. Um, as for the stories that go on, as I mentioned, low fantasy will rarely be the grand heroics, whereas high fantasy is very likely to have a lot of daring do and great stakes. But again, you can mix and match. You can have a, I was about to say a police mystery, but whatever the equivalent of a police drama or detective mystery story is in fantasy, you can have that in a world that is largely high fantasy. Maybe the murder weapon was some strange kind of magic. Who knows? Maybe you need to go to the nefarious underbelly of Goblin Town to track down an informant. It can be high fantasy, but a very grounded story nonetheless. It's just not what high fantasy was built for, but that can usually make it more interesting when it's used for something it isn't built for. The opposite is a bit tougher. Low fantasy with really high stakes stories can come off as really weird, um, but that depends on how you phrase the idea of high stakes stories. It might not be about slaying an evil sorcerer, but having a king wanting to rule all the adjacent lands and being about to take the throne based on ancient heritage and military might could be interesting if the story is about chasing down evidence of this being a lie and heroically saving this evidence, which might be living witnesses, of course, from being destroyed. It's a different kind of high stakes, um, and it's usually a bit more complicated than it would be in high fantasy. But high stakes are not impossible, they are just rarer and a little different in low fantasy. The, the one way you could phrase it is that high fantasy tends to lean towards the epic stories, whereas low fantasy does not. Having low fantasy be epic is a bit harder, and it will not be as straightforward, but it can be done, especially when you consider the idea that not everything needs to be low fantasy. And of course, there is the twist of a secret high fantasy world in which the world seems to be low fantasy or even no fantasy, historical, but in reality there is a higher degree of fantasy that is just hidden. This is very much like the secret technology, the secret science genre. It can also be done in fantasy with secret high fantasy. And technically, I guess it could be done with secret low fantasy, in that a seemingly high fantasy world is just trickery, and someone discovers, oh wait, magic isn't that powerful a thing. It's just some stage magicians being clever about a big conspiracy to make people think that the forest is full of monsters and people are throwing fireballs and reading minds, when in reality it's just trickery, most of it, and a little, a little bit of real magic. So, high and low fantasy are a guideline. They can be a starting point to defining the kind of fantasy world you want, but they are not as rigid as they are often portrayed, and they do not mean the restrictive, or they don't have to mean the same restrictive things that many seem to claim they do. They are just a measure of how fantasy your fantasy really is.